Hello, my name is Holly Flume, and I'm a fellow with the Nash Center for Post-Secondary Improvement. I'll spend in just a few minutes with you today walking you through the process mapping activity that we are asking you to complete before our first workshop together that'll kick off phase two of the Learning Mobility Challenge. So for those who may be unfamiliar with process mapping, it is a valuable tool that we often use in improvement work. It's essentially a visual display of the exact steps of any given process. So it does identify any and all individuals or groups responsible for each step as well. By mapping out the process it currently exists, and note that I emphasized currently, we'll talk about that later on. But it allows us to identify any gaps, variation, unnecessary steps, or otherwise areas for improvement. Process mapping can and should be used anytime that you're focusing on a particular process. In the case of ACRO's Learning Mobility Challenge, that would be reducing the amount of time it takes for a transfer student to receive an admissions decision. Um, as I mentioned, they are a tool, often used to help teams identify where improvements can be made. And that's why we're asking you to complete this prior to phase two. So through this activity, you should be able to identify, where there may be some bottlenecks, or where the process might be clear or inconsistent at your university. Here, I've highlighted some of the best practices for completing your process map. But before I get into the instructions here on the slide, I just want to share, some overall logistics beforehand. I am a firm believer that this activity is best completed using the good old-fashioned paper, pencil, and post-it notes. If you prefer using a digital resource, you can use platforms such as Miro or Canva, or maybe there's something else that you're more accustomed to. But for the challenge, we just welcome you to map out your process using, again, that good old-fashioned method, using your post-it notes. But all you have to do is take a photograph of the final process and submit your image to share. So the good news for you all is that the process has already been identified for you with the Learning Mobility Challenge, or at least the problem that you're trying to map out has already been identified. Hmm. What you'll need to do is first write out the first step and the last step in the process. So think, what triggers this process of students receiving an admissions decision? What does that look like at your institution? And my guess is that it would likely be the submission of a transfer admissions application itself, but definitely work through this with your team. Speaking of teams, one important step that I haven't mentioned yet is that it's definitely in your benefit to include others who have a hand in the process. Bring them all around the table and walk through this together. The reason for that is that most processes are not completed in isolation. You know that. I know that. There can be many stakeholders involved. So bring those folks together to complete your process map together. Back to the instructions here on the slide. Once you've identified on a post-it the first step and the last step, uh, both on separate post-it notes, you'll then identify every single step in the process between those two. So be sure to use detail, no jargon, no acronyms. Everyone in the room should understand what the step entails and who might be responsible for it. As I just mentioned, every single step gets its own post-it note. And be sure to identify also that each step belongs to someone. So just as an example, as you can see here, if transcripts are received, who receives and processes that file? Who attaches it to the student record? Those are just small examples, but it's always a good practice to write out roles and responsibilities while you're process mapping too. And if at any point in time you need to indicate decision points like yes or no, such as did the student submit a transcript? Yes or no. You can rotate your post-it note to be a diamond shape to visually indicate that it's a decision point in the process. And note that the process doesn't end at yes or no. So what happens in those moments? Be sure to continue mapping out even after those decision points. And then finally, one of the best parts about process mapping on Post-it notes is that you can rearrange the sticky notes once you've finished. So once you and your team have decided that the map is a finished product, you have all of the steps included, you can attach the Post-it notes to a larger piece of paper if possible, and then draw arrows to illustrate the flow from the beginning to the end. All right, so now there are some key questions to keep in mind throughout the activity, many of which are listed here. And you have access to these slides separately from the recording, just for quick reference if you need to come back to these or print these off. But think about what the most chaotic parts of the process are, or where it should be easier for the student, the user. What steps may seem duplicative, and what is missing altogether. So I mentioned earlier that you need to map out the process as it currently stands. Do not write in steps that do not exist or are maybe pipe dreams or goals of yours. Identifying the current process will help you visualize those gaps and areas for improvement. However, you and your team should also look for what is driving the process and what is working really well. What might that be? It's just as important to ask the hard questions, what is missing, what is chaotic, as it is to ask yourself or to seek out these positives as well. And then another tool that I always like to talk about, something that we use that's helpful in improvement science is the 5 whys. For those who may not be familiar, this is a root cause analysis tool. It's as simple as asking why 5 times or as many times as you need to, honestly. But doing so will get you to the root cause of any problem in any given process, which typically results in a couple questions that I'll leave you with. And it's why is it like this? Is it a legitimate reason, or is it because we've always done it this way? Implementing the 5 whys will help you get to that root cause. And then one last thing I just want to share with you before turning it over to you and your teams, before you work on your own process maps, is this example right here. This is the level of detail that you can and probably should include in your process maps. From the time a student hits submit on their transfer application to your school to the time that a decision is issued. So what takes place in between then? It's most certainly not a 3-step process. There are many things that likely must take place, documents that must be received, key stakeholders that are involved. Be sure to map out every single piece of that detail here in this activity. So that concludes our tutorial on process mapping. Please reach out in Canvas if you have any questions, and we look forward to seeing your submissions. Thank you.